Hello everyone and welcome to the 5th inquiry webinar. We are resuming the inquiry webinar series after a short break, and this is just so that all of us continue learning during the lockdown. Okay, so what is the inquiry webinar series? For those of you who are new here, we are doing this series of webinars to introduce you to some of the tools of inquiry and some of the concepts of inquiry that will help you learn to figure out answers to questions that you have on your own. In other words, that will help you become inquirers. Okay, so today we have with us members of the Think team. We have Madhav, who you must have seen in previous Think webinars. And we have Aarti, who's appearing for the first time on the inquiry webinars. And she's going to help us with the questions in the second half of the webinar. And I'm Aditi. And right, so the subject of today's webinar is what is a scientific theory? And we've heard the word theory a lot probably. And I remember growing up, it used to sound very intimidating to me. But today we try to unpack it in a way so that you can understand what the components of a theory are, which will help you construct theories of your own. So the plan for the webinar is that for the first 30 or 40 minutes, we will discuss a few examples and discuss a few scenarios which will help you understand the concept of a scientific theory. And then we will go on to questions that you have. So do leave them in the comments as and when they arise. Okay, so let's dive in. What is a theory? That is obviously the question that all of you must have, and we will discuss it as we go through some examples. So Madhav?
Yeah, so I think it's important that, so rather than giving an explanation of what a theory is and going and giving you some sort of definition, it will be much more useful if we actually took some examples to illustrate what a theory is and actually like get dirty by actually building a theory. So that's the plan for today. So the first thing we'll deal with is something which, a phenomena which you guys are all very familiar with, day and night. So in the sense that, yeah.
Do you want to scroll down on the Google Docs?
Yeah, I have scrolled down.
Oh, okay. I'm not able to see it for some reason. My bad.
Okay. I hope that's not a problem for the people watching. So let's first deal with day and night. So it's a familiar phenomena to everybody. In a 24-hour period, we experience a period of light. That period of light may be different each day, but there's a period of light which we call daytime, and a period of darkness we call nighttime, right? And so how do we explain that, right? So the goal is to construct a theory which explains that phenomenon which we see. The first thing we notice is that corresponding to daytime, we see the sun appearing on the horizon and charting a path across the sky. And when as it becomes nighttime, the sun disappears again on the other side. So how do we explain this? So what we are assuming now, because we see this correspondence between the sun and and light, we're assuming that there's the presence of the sun results in daytime and its absence results in nighttime. Okay. And for the purpose of the rest of this example, what we're going to assume is that both the sun and the earth are spherical objects, right? That itself will require justification, but for now we're going to assume that. And the important thing here is to, so notice that if we did not assume that the sun and the earth were spherical, then you could explain daylight and nighttime in various ways, right? You could have some sort of a disk with as the earth with the sun moving like this or something like that, right? It moves away, it comes back, something of that sort. But for now, we're going to assume that the earth and the sun are spherical objects. Okay, so now let's try and work through some explanations for that. Okay, one explanation this is the explanation, I think, which is obvious to children when they first come across this, is that the earth doesn't move and the sun revolves around the earth, right? You think when you're a child, well, people till very long ago, they assume that the earth is stationary and the sun is charting a path across the sky, right?
Right.
And I think everyone can, sorry.
So the earth is stationary because that's our experience of the earth.
That's our experience of the earth as being stationary. And the sun kind of charts a path moving across the sky. And as you can see, if you were, say, standing, on this GIF, if you were standing on some point over there, you see at sometimes the sun is over you and the sun results in light, so you have daytime. And at another point, the sun is not over you and therefore you have nighttime.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like the first obvious thing to think of as an explanation. Right. And it does explain this phenomenon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty obviously.
Right. If we take into account only the phenomenon of day and night, and then this theory is sufficient to explain that.
Yeah, the statement explains that observation, right?
Right.
Of day and night. Okay. Now another explanation is that the sun doesn't move and the earth revolves around the sun in a day, or 24-hour period, or whatever you want to call it,
mm-hmm.
right? So if you can see that also kind of explains, right? If you were here on the earth, and this is the sun, it's daytime, and as it moves there, you're facing away from the sun. Mm-hmm. You're on this side of the finger, and it's nighttime, right? So that explains day and night as well. Okay. Mm-hmm. Daytime and nighttime is what we were calling it, just because the word day is a little ambiguous, right? It can mean day mm-hmm. as in daylight, daytime, and day as in a day. Yeah, so let's be clear. Okay. So, and a third explanation is neither the sun or the earth changes their location and the earth rotates, right? Mm-hmm. Very clearly you can see that in this GIF that it's nighttime when at the back over here, and is daytime in the front. Okay. Right. This also does a very good job at explaining day and night. Mm-hmm. Right. Then there's the model which you see usually, which is the earth rotates on its axis in a day and revolves around the sun in 365 days. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. But the question is, do we need this?
Right. So this is the theory we all learn in school.
Yeah.
Directly, but to explain the phenomenon of day and night.
So yeah.
So you might think that this is advanced, and one might ask, why do we need the phenomenon of, or why do we need to use the Earth's revolution around the sun along with its rotation to explain the phenomenon of day and night, right?
Yeah. So if we just had the phenomenon of day and night and we didn't have anything else, right? At that stage, you don't need the revolution around the sun, and the 24-hour rotation is all you need for day and night, right? So this explanation 3, which is a subset of explanation 1, is sufficient in order to explain day and night, and this just adds in extra things which are not required for this particular phenomenon, right? I think that makes sense, right? But maybe if we add more phenomena in to the mix, like you can imagine adding in seasons, right? And so on. At that stage, maybe then you need the earth revolving around the sun as well. Maybe.
Yeah, but before we go into that, I just want to clarify that we began with a phenomenon that we all observe and we all experience, right? And now we picked a couple of those observations from that phenomenon, and we decided to try and explain how they happen. And we did that we made certain assumptions right at the beginning. We said that we're assuming that the Earth and the sun are spherical objects, and that it is the presence of the sun that results in daytime and the absence of the sun that results in nighttime. And using that, we've come up with multiple different combinations of the Earth and the relative position of the sun, as in both their positions relative to each other, and how they might all explain the same phenomenon. So all of these are theories which at this point explain this phenomenon of day and night. Now, if we go on to the other phenomena that we observe, and if we bring in those into the fold, we might have to see if all of our theories are able to explain those additional phenomena as well. Right, Madhav? So what are those?
So we may have to change those theories. We may have to reject some of these theories if we are unable to use them in order to explain new phenomena which come in, right? Let's pick one more phenomenon, right? Which is that it gets hotter during the day and cooler at night, right? Now, do any of these theories explain that? Well, not really. Why should there be a relationship between any of these things and heat and heat, right? It gets hotter during the day, it gets cooler at night. Why? What is that relationship? So, in order to explain that, we need to add in another assumption into our initial two assumptions. Let me go back up to them. The initial two assumptions were, Aditi just mentioned them, that the presence of the sun results in daytime and absence results in nighttime, and both the earth and sun are spherical objects. Now we need to add in that light and heat are related to each other. In some way, can be more precise than that when we actually formulate it, but I think people know what we're trying to say, that as it gets brighter, more light results in more heat or something of that sort. More light from the sun results in more heat. So that is, that's an assumption we need to add in. Once we add in that assumption, then all of these theories explain that observation.
Right. So just to clarify, what we're trying to say is one reason why we can make that assumption is that as we see, as it gets brighter in the day, it gets hotter in the day. And as we move further into the nighttime, it gets cooler. Right. So, based on that, we're making the assumption that heat has something to do with light. Right?
Yeah, this is more of a background assumption. We're not doing it necessarily based on this particular example. That's something which is probably the result of another theory, just as the earth being spherical is a result of another theory, the consequence of another theory, or it could be an observation if you actually go into space and view the earth, but it could be one of those things, either of those things. But in this case, this relationship between heat and light is the result of some theory of light that we have and some theory of heat that we have, which have some relationship, right? So that's where that background assumption comes from.
Right. And like you said, presently, all the four explanations that we brought up are adequate, are enough to tell us that to explain how it gets hotter during the day and how it gets cooler during the night. Because if we go over all of them, we see that it's brighter during the day, and because brightness has something to do with heat, that's why all four theories are still adequate. So you did mention that at some point theories need to change, that we might have to change our theory in order to explain certain phenomena. So why don't we explore that a little more? And we'll come back to this example when we wrap up, right?
Okay. So now let's move on to a completely different example. Nothing to do with heavenly bodies, but to do with bodies. Sorry. That was terrible. So we are aliens who have just arrived from Mars, who are curious about how human bodies work. So now we're putting ourselves in this scenario. We have no idea how human anatomy works at all. And our religion prohibits us from cutting open human bodies and seeing what's inside them. And this includes dead human bodies. Okay. It's a religious thing. We're not going to break that, or we go to hell. So now, but we want to figure out how the body works without actually cutting things open. Okay. So when we notice that, we see this phenomena. When humans put objects into an orifice near the top of their bodies, which they call mouths, there's some movement around the mouth, like they move them up and down, something like that. And when they open their mouth, you notice that the objects aren't there anymore, right? They've disappeared, right? When you see, usually say you put something in a cupboard, you leave it there, you open it, it's still there, right? Unless someone's stolen it or something like that, but it's still there. But that doesn't happen here. It disappears. So that requires some explanation. So how would we explain that? Where do the objects go?
Right. So one way to think about it is that the human body is hollow, and that as humans put objects into their mouth, and after they make that action, it just falls inside the body.
It falls inside the hollow body.
It falls inside the hollow body.
Yeah. I was actually planning on drawing this, but my pen thing doesn't seem to be working right now. So, sorry. So hopefully I've been trying to draw it right now. Nothing's coming. So let's try and do it by talking. Okay. So so as you said, one possible explanation is that the entire body is hollow, right? So when you take something in, it falls down and just takes the space which
the space would be your feet, right? Naturally, because that's the lowest point in the body.
Yeah, it will start from there.
Yeah, and the food will start depositing
at your feet, and then at humans' feet. We're not humans. So at the feet of humans, and it kind of builds its way up as it goes. Okay. Okay. So that's one possible explanation, right?
But there seems to be something odd about that explanation.
Why?
Because I would think that if humans keep putting food in, then their feet would start swelling up if they eat a lot. Or if they keep putting a lot of food in. So then, do we see that happening, really?
Not really, right? You see the torso swelling up sometimes, but you rarely ever see the feet. You don't see the feet swelling up because of food. And the other thing you would expect is, for instance, the legs to give a hollow sound or something like that, right? If they're hollow, because they're relatively rigid bodies, so you would expect them to give a hollow sound. They don't, right? So this is a background.
Artie's
pointing at her head.
To the okay. Let's just explain what we mean by that. So, for example, if humans tap their tummies, then there seems to be some sound that comes in that would indicate that it's hollow, as opposed to when you would tap your foot. When humans would tap their foot.
No, it's not necessary. That's not exactly the point. When you have like a rigid body and you tap it, say that you have some sort of glass or something like that, which is rigid and closed, which is hollow. When you tap it, the sound is different from when you fill it up, right? When it's rigid, not when it's not when it's non-rigid. Like the torso is less rigid, right? So basically the idea is that you would expect swelling up, which you don't see, and you would expect certain sounds. So it seems like we can reject that it goes all the way down below the legs, right? Or to the legs. But maybe, so let me amend your theory a little bit, your model a little bit, and say that it stops at the torso, at the bottom of the torso.
Okay.
Right? You're hollow everywhere till the bottom of your torso. And for the same reason as we excluded the feet and legs, we can exclude the arms. Right? There's some sort of a stop, some plate or something that stops the food from going here. But the rest of the torso is hollow.
Right.
Okay. Reasonable. Okay. That sounds good. So now let's bring in another observation. Sorry, I was planning on drawing stuff there, but I can't right now. Well, so periodically humans expel some materials from their bodies, brown colored stuff usually, through another orifice located towards the middle of their bodies at the back, usually. I mean, I haven't seen it in any other position, so I'm going to assume that for all humans, it's at the back. So now, how do we explain that?
But what makes you think that the phenomenon of humans putting things into their mouths and humans expelling things have something to do with each other?
That's interesting, right? So how do we know that the stuff you put in is related to the stuff that pops out? That's so I'm actually going to leave that aside for now, and we're going to assume that it's the case, right?
Okay, that they're related.
That they're related. That the material which goes in is related to the material which goes out. Okay. So now, how do we explain that?
You could imagine that there is a tube that goes in.
Yeah, so meaning we can explain it because there's the orifice, and the things which are in your body, they just come out of that orifice, right? Because we've said that the top of the body is hollow.
Yeah.
That's the theory we're going with right now. All the way down to the torso is hollow, and so you let the stuff out through that the other orifice, right?
So we don't need to assume that we need anything else right now.
No, we don't, because what we have is sufficient. But there's a problem, right? What would you expect if there's a hole at the top and a hole at the bottom?
The stuff you put in comes out immediately.
Comes out immediately, right? We don't see that, right?
No. Yeah.
Since we don't see the stuff going in, popping out immediately, how do we explain that?
Maybe there's a valve in between somewhere.
Right? Stopping things going out till there's some mechanism which allows it to go out. We don't know. Right? Okay. So that's one possible, that's a possible explanation, right? That there's a valve where the things which are inside get stopped. Okay. Okay. So now what about that? So now what? So it would be really useful if I could draw it, but yeah, we can't right now. So what we have right now, let's go through the model, since we can't draw it. It's useful to go through it again. Is that we have the torso having some sort of plate at the bottom, stopping things from going into the legs, stopping the stuff. But the rest of it is hollow. It fills up. Okay. Then we have a valve connected to an orifice at the bottom of the torso, which allows stuff out in particular conditions. What those conditions are is not important. Okay. I'm sure that seems like it should be clear. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
What if I brought in another thing that when we stand upside down, or when humans stand upside down, things don't fall out of their mouth immediately.
Yeah, things don't fall out of their mouth immediately, right? So if you would expect that everything's hollow and then you stand on your head, the humans stand on their head, then it would pop out from their mouth. But that doesn't happen. So how would we explain that?
Perhaps there's another valve somewhere.
There's another valve maybe in some narrow part over here on the neck, which stops it from going out. Okay.
Right. So, so far these seem to be sufficiently satisfactory explanations for the phenomena that we have chosen. Right. And
yeah, so I think it might be useful to go through what we did right now, since we weren't able to draw it. We have to kind of imagine it. So we started with the phenomena of something disappearing in your mouth, from humans' mouths. And our explanation for that is it just falls in, the thing's hollow, it falls to the bottom. Then we saw that it doesn't seem like it goes all the way down to the bottom, right? Because there's no swelling, there's nothing getting bigger at the bottom, which you would expect. Feet and legs and knees and so on are pretty rigid. It seems unlikely that there's stuff going down all the way there. However, the torso, there is expansion and contraction and so on. So that part, it seems like it could be that it's hollow all till your torso, till the bottom of your torso, right? So that was the model we arrived at. Okay. Then what we needed to explain, we brought in another observation, which was that there was something in some period. So periodically, there's an expelling of some material, right? Which we are for now assuming is related to what came in. In order to explain that expelling, we postulated a valve. It's not the expelling which needed the valve. It's like that the expelling didn't happen instantly, which needed the valve, right? And then Aditi brought in another phenomenon where we needed another valve around maybe somewhere here in order to explain why things don't come out when you stand on your head. So that is where we are that is where we are at this point. We have this theory which seems pretty good, right, at explaining all the phenomena we have so far.
But I want to add in another phenomenon just to
okay.
We don't see humans, the top half of the human's torso is expanding as they eat. The expansion is limited to a certain location in the torso.
Yeah. So humans say, oh, I feel bloated or something like that. And that usually correlates with them having like the what they call the stomach area, whatever, being expanded, bulged, having a bulge, right? So maybe it's not the chest area where the expansion happens, but lower down, right? So maybe what we need to explain that is not hollowness, but some sort of a container. Right?
Yeah.
So we could postulate that container in order to get this explanation, right? Get what we need. Okay. Yeah. So I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to draw the stuff. So I don't know whether it's useful to continue too much more with this particular example.
I think based on the kind of comments we're receiving, it'll be useful to circle back into the idea of what a theory is, right? So just going over some of the things we did today, we started with the example of a phenomena that we can observe, right? The phenomena of day and night. And we took that up and we tried to come up with an explanation for how that phenomenon happens. And then we tried a few different explanations which adequately explain that phenomenon. Then we moved on to another example, which was the anatomy of the human body, right? And we tried to unpack, based on what we can observe about the human body, what the possible contents of the human body are. Particularly, we focused ourselves on food that humans eat and waste that humans expel, and what could possibly be the connection between that. And what we were trying to do is build a model to sort of explain how that happens, how the process of eating food is related to the process of expelling waste, and what the possible internal components of the human body could be that allow that to happen. So these are examples of theories, and that is like if these are the basic components of a scientific theory, which is observations and an explanation, right? And
so the goal is to get an explanation for an observation or a set of observations. And in order to do that, we postulate things. We say that this is true, these statements. So like let me go back up to the Earth and Sun. The Sun does not move and the Earth revolves around the Sun in 24 hours. That's a statement we've postulated in order to explain the observation of day and night, of the Sun moving around the Earth, of the temperature cycle during the day, right? So that's, So it's not, the theory is not the explanation, but the theory is this postulation which results in the explanation. But the postulate which results in the explanation.
Right. So the set of statements which allow us to explain a certain observation is what a scientific theory is. And what is interesting is that these are the basic components of any scientific theory, right? So even theories which may appear very complex and advanced, scientific theories which may appear very complex and advanced, are fundamentally composed of these components.
Yeah.
Um,
So to add to that, I would add in background assumptions, which were things which we assumed from either from other theories or things we just assumed, such as the Earth being spherical, and Earth and Sun being spherical, the relationship between heat and light, that there's a relationship between what goes in and what comes out. At this, maybe we can construct something to explain those, but no matter how far you go, there will always be some background assumptions you'll be making.
mhm.
And that's an important thing too. So that's all of these together constitute a theory.
Right. So just to build on that a little bit, we came like the theory that we usually learn in school today when it comes to the solar system and so on involves the final explanation that we showed, which is that the Earth revolves around the sun and both rotates. Right. Why is it that we need that explanation?
So we need that explanation we need that model in order to explain things like seasons and so on, right? When we bring in other phenomena. The problem is no one ever sees a scientific theory being constructed. You only see the outcome. And that's the important part, which needs to become a part of education, which is the students actually either witnessing a scientific theory being constructed, kind of like we did now, but hopefully with something you can draw with, or actually constructing a scientific theory. That's something which is completely missing in education, right? You're just presented with something and then you're like wowed by it because it's how the hell do you come up with something like that? And you don't get an understanding of how science actually works.
Right. So putting together these components of what you observe and then developing a theory is a useful process that children should learn in school. And instead of giving them theories that other people have created directly in all circumstances, we should try and come up with scenarios where they are actively involved in constructing their own theories. And in fact, anybody, not just in school, but any learner who wants to figure things out on their own can clearly state observations and come up with an explanation or come up with a set of statements that explain that phenomenon.
Yeah, and yeah, it requires a lot of like imagination, insight, and intuition and all of these sorts of things. And kids come up with like amazing things. Like for instance, there was in one of the schools, I think was working with for explaining day and night. The kid came up with the Earth and the sun rotating around each other, right? And it works. The explanation works. Like kind of like a twin star thing, if you know what that is. Meaning, if you've seen enough Star Wars, you'll probably seen enough of those sorts of things. So that was his explanation, and it was amazing that he was able to actually construct an explanation which explained the phenomenon. So that's what we're trying to do here during this webinar, to demonstrate what that could look like.
Right. So we actually okay, so I think this is a good time to start going over some of the questions that we have from the audience. And if all of you have questions, we request you to please put them in the comments so we can start going over them. I'll hand over to Aarti now, who will help us with the questions.
So for some of the questions, I think initially the participants were not very clear about what a theory is. And we had a couple of questions on the same. But I think the way Madhav and Aditi structured this, you first came up with examples and then went on.
Oops. Aarti? Oops, we seem to have lost Aarti.
She seems to have disconnected from the call.
Yeah. Okay. So I actually have the questions open. So hopefully we can go through some of them. So Shiladitya, I hope I got your name reasonably close to what it is. So asks, how do these explanations account for the observation that duration of daytime changes for different days of the year? Well, it doesn't. so none of these explanations actually account for the observation that duration of daytime changes for different days of the year, because that these models have not been built to do that. They would have to be changed in order to explain something like that.
Right. And I think as we demonstrated in the second half, in the second example that we used, is that there will be observations like this that you will notice that your theory doesn't explain. And it's important to integrate those observations as a part of the same thing that you're explaining, and then come up with a theory that will then explain all of those observations together.
Yeah, so we'll have to explain. Aarti, if you muted yourself, you need to unmute yourself. Aarti is back. So we need to explain, in order to explain, for instance, the changes in duration on different times of the year. Say we take this explanation, the explanation one, which is that the Earth does not move and the sun revolves around the Earth. We will need to change that by having some sort of a movement of the sun up and down if we still want the Earth to be stationary. The sun will have to move up north and south as the year goes on in order to explain something like that. Yeah. So.
Right. So perhaps you could pick up one of the theories that we discussed here and try to see how you can make changes to it such that these observations are explained.
Yeah, as a hint that you can amend all of these theories to explain things like seasons. You can explain things like the changes in length of day and night using all of these theories. Ptolemy developed a geocentric theory. That means Earth at the center of the universe, which does a very good job at explaining all of these things. Many phenomena. There's some phenomena which he didn't have access to, which you can't explain using that, but most phenomena which you can actually observe with your eyes and so on, you can explain with geocentrism.
Right. So, Aarti?
Yeah, so the next question is a bit of a conversation among three participants. So Vignesh has asked, not clear what you refer to as theory in the explanations for day and night circle, for which Siladitya has replied saying, it means a good guess to explain the observation. And Vidya has replied saying, it's a possible mechanism with proper justifications that is put forth to explain the concept of day and night circle.
Yeah, so I'm going to sidestep the notion of a mechanism, because there can be mechanistic theories and non-mechanistic theories, and that's something which we can leave for later. But yeah, meaning saying that a theory is a good guess to explain an observation is, I think, a reasonable starting point. You have a certain set of observations and you need to invent statements whose consequences explain those observations, right? That's what a theory is. The set of statements and the consequences of those statements is the theory.
So when you say invent these statements, that means that you might have to bring in concepts that previously didn't exist, and that you might have to come up with these concepts. So for example, if you are not able to observe the insides of the human body and you want to think of something within the torso that is holding the food in the human body in between while it is being consumed and expelled, then that would be something that you're inventing, right? To sort of explain.
Yeah, you're inventing a concept which you can't observe. And you have to do that when you're constructing a theory. So in Newtonian mechanics, concepts of force and mass are not actually defined anywhere. They're not observable. They're defined in terms of the theory itself.
Right. So when you mean they're not defined anywhere, you mean they're not observable.
They're not observable, and there's no one sentence definition of them, meaning they're theoretical notions. But let's not go into that.
Okay. All right. That's for a later webinar, perhaps.
So I think along those lines, the next question also probably has to be sidestepped. So Arun has said that mechanism becomes theory when it can also make predictions that are testable.
Yeah, not just mechanisms, but things. The goal is to make predictions. Testability, non-testability is a different matter. Whether they're testable or not, they may not be testable today. They may be testable when we have tools to test them. The goal just ought to be that it explains observations which you see.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it explains observations which you see. It doesn't make any sense. Observations.
Yeah. Right. And just one more thing, that when we say predictions, we're using the word to mean logical consequences here. So, for example, we've been talking about a theory as a set of propositions, right? Or a set of statements that we are using to explain observations. And so these predictions, what we mean by that is the logical consequences of those statements.
Yeah,
right?
we do not mean future telling or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just the logical consequences of predictions, of statements.
Okay.
No.
So we have another comment from Anand Ahuja. So he asks, explanation or development of the theory of day and night and theory of seasons requires an understanding of some geometry of lines, circles, motions, etc. So what do you teach first and what do you teach next? So his question is on how do we sequence our lesson plans such that we cover this?
Meaning, so you're saying that people need some understanding before they get to constructing a theory of day and night or constructing a theory of the sun and the earth. Yeah, sure. Meaning that's important, and people will need the pre-knowledge, some level of pre-knowledge before coming here. For instance, they would have to have observed or be given the observation that there's day and night, right? That much pre-knowledge, I think most people have already, but there's a lot of pre-knowledge which may be required for certain theories, which will need to be developed. Yeah.
And at the same time, sorry. Go on, Auntie.
So he's mentioned understanding of some geometry of lines, circles, motion. So I think these are enough to have at a very preliminary level, right? I mean, we can construct theories based on which class you're teaching to, right? And it could be at different levels.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we didn't really use much geometry more than like intuitive notions. Right. Meaning, we at least for today, we didn't need anything more precise than what a circle is, and I think most people know what a circle is. Maybe when we get into details, that's when yes, you will need more detailed geometry, maybe trigonometry, maybe various other things.
Right. I want to point out that children of even like very young ages come up with theories of their own, right? And they do it only with, those are very rudimentary theories, of course, with limited scope, but they do it using experiential understanding of things. And that may be sufficient to start encouraging them to build these theories.
I mean, just in general, you want age-appropriate things, right? So when children have the pre-knowledge to be able to work on certain things, you give them the ability, you allow them to work with those things. So for instance, going into details of Newton's theory will require some level of calculus. That's clearly not something even a ninth grader would be able to do, or at least a general ninth grader. So the idea would be that you would hold on to that, onto the details. But there's a lot of Newton's theory which is accessible to a ninth grader, a conceptual version of the theory rather than like a formulaic, like a formal version.
So the point you're making, Madhav, is that you have to focus on the ability to construct theory rather than teach the actual theory, which requires
exactly. That's a great point, Arti, because so for instance, this theory of anatomy is not useful for anybody. Right. Exactly. The actual outcome. I can give you a YouTube video where you learn a lot more than you would learn out of in 5 minutes than you would in like 30 hours in terms of anything about human anatomy, information about human anatomy. The goal here was how to construct a theory. And that's why we picked something which everyone has access to in human bodies in order to give students the ability to construct theories.
So we go on to questions from the second half of the session, my favorite one on human anatomy. So Anand says, use of words like orifice, torso, hollow, valves, etc. itself requires understanding of other concepts.
So we had just talked about this, that yes, there's pre-knowledge required, and that's an important thing for people.
And actually, when it comes to these words, you may not need to know, you need not use these exact words to describe the things. I mean, somebody can say a flap instead of a valve. Somebody can say,
you can call it a door if you want, which opens one way but doesn't open the other. You can call it many people have seen a door which opens one way, but you can't push it the other way. So that's exactly the same, the concept. Orifice, you can use hole. There's various, depending on your audience, you can choose your language suitably.
Yes.
And there were some more comments on, this is with respect to the correlation between what goes in and what comes out. Like you said, let's take it for granted. So actually you need not. People have pointed that out. The body has something to the stuff that goes in because they look and smell different. That's one thing. That's a point to say that they're not correlated. And there's also a point to say from Anand, who says, the stuff you expel is related to the material you eat from the seeds of some fruits like bindi, guava that you see, and the color of some food like beetroot also in the correlation we need to then open. So
the smell of asparagus definitely lingers.
Okay, let's not dwell on that.
I think our audience is sufficiently experienced.
Well informed.
Cabbage is a very important. So
excellent.
So the homework is everyone has to compare what the smells of what goes in to what comes out for the next webinar.
So that this is of course in order for everyone to learn to construct good theories.
Of course.
Yeah. One thing we didn't mention also was that the weight, there's a difference, right? So you can even need to explain that.
Yeah, the difference in the weight of what you eat.
You could also try and establish that by measuring before what goes in and what comes out. That the weight is different.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the point here was that you need not assume that there is a connection, that there are observations that help you establish that connection.
Yeah.
Okay.
And another point for that is you can explain that the food you take in and expel is related because of the feeling of fullness you experience after taking food and the emptiness you feel when you expel the food.
That's very poetic.
A little tricky, poetic, okay.
Okay.
The emptiness you feel.
Okay. So, in the example of human body, an alien can make many observations about how a human functions. How does it know which observations are relevant, inventing the explanation about the food going in? That's interesting. So how do we pick the observations? I mean, like some of it may not even seem related. Then how do we know that they're related?
Yeah. So in terms of, sorry, I'm not exactly clear what the question is asking, but if you're saying how does someone know which observations are relevant? It's because you've picked an observation which you think is interesting. We started with something goes in and it disappears. And that's interesting because it doesn't usually happen. Something which is surprising is an important observation.
Something that's puzzling.
Which is puzzling, right? That's the way you know why an observation is relevant, just generally. But then once you have a theory or something, some explanation, something like this, that the Earth does not move and the sun revolves around the Earth, at that point, then you're looking for observations which require to either change the theory or to reject the theory, right? So you're looking for observations in the ballpark which require, in this arena, like in the thing of the Earth and sun, which will require you to change the theory. So that's how you figure out what is appropriate. I don't know how clear that was. But.
Actually, one other thing that I wanted to mention here is that a lot of the times phenomenon that may not appear to be explained by the same theory could actually be. And I think one of the greatest parts about Newton's theory of motion is that it brought together observations of motion that you saw right here on Earth, right, with objects that you handle around you, and at the same time also explained observations of motions of planets, right, that you
So
saw.
that's a principle of theory building, that the more a theory can explain with a less amount of statements, not necessarily less amount of statement, but more a theory can explain while being simple. That's a better theory.
Right. But here in this case, what I wanted to point out is that one might not think that observations that you see on Earth are related to motions of planets, and yet they are. I guess that has to do with that's the component of insight, right? Sometimes it may be completely clear, the scope of what you are trying to explain, or the theory that you're trying to construct. But a lot of the times, insights could help you.
Definitely, like that insight that it's not surprising that people didn't come up with Newton's theory. Not everyone came up with it, right? It took really long for someone to come up with it. That's because it's extremely weird that there's a relationship between dropping an apple on the Earth and the Earth going around the sun. Given that it's extremely weird, you need some sort of like inspiration to hit you in order to come up with that theory.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I also think somewhere the person who asked this question has it in mind that we note all the observations that are relevant and then build a theory, and whereas it's actually cyclic, am I right? So you see some observations, you try to construct a theory, and then you realize that these are also related observations, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in fact, you want to start with a small number of observations or even one observation like we did, because if you start with too many things to begin with, it's going to be too much information and the human mind will not be able to deal with that. So you want to start with one or two things.
So some of the additional observations that you could use in our first example is what somebody already brought it up, is that the change in the cycle of the day and the duration of day and night. Other examples could be the same change that, a cyclical change that you can observe in terms of yearly temperature cycles, right? Those are what constitute seasons. So one could think that are any of these theories sufficient to explain the phenomenon that we observe of seasons? And you could go on like that and come up with and take more observations into the fold of your theory and try to modify it in such a way that all of those observations are explained.
Yeah. So it's not just the observations and the explanations, but then it's also these assumptions we're making in the background.
Right, of course.
Which are very important, because if those get rejected, then you're in trouble, right? If something.
So one of our participants has asked almost what we just explained. The assumptions that we need to make in order to construct theories, are those related to our ability to be intuitive?
Yeah, meaning, so people, when you say ability to be intuitive, people assume that that's some sort of innate capacity or something like that. It just, the way it's said, it sounds like you're asking whether it's some sort of innate capacity. I don't know whether that's actually what you mean, but well, intuition is developed by working on things like this over time. And yes, it's very important that people develop the ability for intuition, but that'll require an understanding of theory building generally, understanding of and actually knowing how to build a theory. And then and then more than that, then you'll have to like immerse yourself into the field which the theory is being built about. It's only when you're like embedded into that area that you will actually come up with insightful things. So like I think Poincaré talked about it, that he would spend hours and hours going through. He's a mathematician, going through the mathematics. Nothing would strike him, but it was very important that he spent those hours and hours going through the mathematics in order to see things. It was then like just at a random point, where the intuition hit eventually.
I think some, like a simpler analogy for this would be with cooking, right? A lot of the times, like when you start off, it's almost as if you need like explicit instructions of how much of what to use and to come up with a dish. But if you look at experienced cooks or chefs, they almost have this sense of what to put in and what to do to create a dish or to create a certain flavor. I think that also comes with experience, like how much time you spend on those things. And yeah, it is certainly something that can be developed. And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's take the.
Yeah, so there's another statement from Siddharth. It says, the more things that a theory can explain for a smaller set of statements in the theory, that's the better theory. So this is, he's alluding to your explanation for how you decide on which is a better theory. And he's saying this is a value judgment that you're placing on the theory building process. It doesn't necessarily improve the explanatory power of the theory.
It doesn't improve the explanatory power at all. That's not the goal. So, for instance, let me give you a very a theory with a lot of statements about the sun and the earth. I can at every point of time during the day, I can tell you where the sun and the earth are in relation to each other, right? And each of those are separate statements unrelated to each other, right? Those things together will explain what the earth and sun, right? And explain all the observations that we see. I can give you the earth in relation to the sun. It's these many miles away, then it's these many miles away, then it's these many miles away. It's in these positions related to each other. This part of the earth is in front of this part of the sun. I can do that. That's a lot of statements, and it'll give me an explanation. Now I can rewrite that statement in terms of an elliptical orbit of the earth around the sun and the rotation of the earth around its axis. Which one's a better theory? Now both of them explain the same phenomenon, right? And both of them, if you were to put them into a computer, the thing would look the same. The GIF which you make out of them would look exactly the same. Which one's the better theory? I think very clearly we would agree that the one which had the less number of statements, which was easier to understand for humans, was the better theory, because that's the goal, to understand what's going on. It is a value judgment I'm placing, but that's exactly the point.
And this is called the Occam's razor or something like that, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, yeah. But it's not, but we shouldn't say the statement that this is, not saying that for more things, it's not necessarily the case that a shorter theory is better than a longer theory, right? It's just that in general, all else being equal, you want a theory with less postulates over a theory with more postulates. If the theory with less postulates fails to explain something which the theory with more postulates explains, we may pick the theory with more postulates. If the theory with less postulates is wrong, in the sense its predictions are false, then we reject that and we pick the one with more postulates.
So he's clarified, Siddharth, saying that I was going for Einstein's gravitational theory versus Newton's gravitational theory.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that's great, because Newton's gravitational theory is much shorter, but it doesn't explain everything.
It doesn't explain.
In fact, it's false, right? Under certain circumstances.
Under circumstances, right.
Okay.
Or it's an approximation.
I think it's about time for us to wrap up.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for asking us all those questions. Just to sum up what came up during the webinar, what the webinar was really about. So we tried to tackle the question, what is a scientific theory? And to briefly answer that, I think using the examples that we brought up, what we were trying to say is that a scientific theory is composed of a set of phenomena that are usually observable, and then a set of statements that we come up to explain those puzzling phenomena that call for an explanation. And those are the basic components of a scientific theory. And so you may start with, like, even very young children may ask you, why does it get bright during the day and why does it get dark at night? And at this point, and this is a question that a really young child could ask. And at this point, some part of us would want to say, oh, it's because of the sun revolving around the earth revolving around the sun and so on. But that, I think that's a good opportunity for the child to come up with an explanation of his or her own. And that is what we mean when we say the ability to construct theories, and what we spoke about as the insight and the intuition required to construct theories, and the imagination more than insight and intuition, I think, in this example, to come up with theories. So with that basic structure of a theory now available to you, we encourage you to take up these examples that we discussed today further and try to see what other observations you could put together, and which would prove these theories to be false, or which would require you to modify these theories as much as possible, and such that you can explain the same observations. And this is one of the things that scientists actually do when they construct theories. So basically, this was an introduction to thinking like a scientist in some sense. And so thank you for joining us in our 5th inquiry webinar. Stay tuned to our social media pages if you would like to receive updates about upcoming webinars. We plan to do these once every month. Okay, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
See you guys.